Rent to rent is often pitched as the low or no money down way to invest into property. It can be used for HMOs and Airbnbs. I started my Airbnb business in 2019 with two business partners, and we ended up having two units. One on a lease option, which I'll talk about in another video in the future, and the second one was a rent to rent deal. Now, I would hands down never ever do a rent to rent deal again, and this video is giving you my experience of it. Hello people, I'm Jim and welcome to the channel. I'm a part-time property investor who's trying to document my journey to financial freedom from my full-time job in the oil and gas industry. I'll break down everything to do with property investing and investing in general, and how to get a better grip on your personal finances. First up, let me explain what a rent-to-rent deal is. It involves a property investor, let's call him Keith. So Keith wants to start an Airbnb business, but Keith is absolutely skint and only has a few grand to invest to start his business. So after doing some research online and probably accepting a load of cookies so we can get some lovely targeted ads about different training courses, he comes across a strategy called rent-to-rent, which is perfect for someone who has little to no money to invest. All he has to do is set up a limited company and find landlords to rent properties off, so he can repurpose them as an Airbnb unit. He would typically find these properties by either going through an estate agent and using online portals like Rightmove, or he could go direct to landlords with some leaflet drops or by going to networking events. Once he has found the property and a landlord he can work with, Keith will sign a corporate tenancy agreement. All this means is his limited company is the sitting tenant and he can repurpose the unit for short-term accommodation. The way to think about repurposing is you tip the house upside down and everything which would fall out would be Keith's responsibility. So furniture, beds, TVs, basically anything which will make the property look like a nice Airbnb unit. Now this is an overview of how the strategy works. Now I'm going to break down why I don't like rent-to-rent deals and my personal experience. One of the biggest assumptions is that rent-to-rent is a no or low money down property investing strategy. This is the biggest load of bullshit when it comes to rent-to-rent deals. When people talk about doing a rent-to-rent deal with no money down, what they really mean is go out and get loads of personal credit cards with 0% interest for 18 months and put everything to kit out the unit on these credit cards. Now for me, this is really bad investment advice. I completely understand and agree with getting as much good debt as possible. Normally we do this in the form of a mortgage. This is good debt because it's loaned against the asset, which is the property, and typically the interest rates are pretty low. This can't be said for credit cards. It's in your personal name, which means you have to take 100% responsibility for paying the money back. You can also guarantee that when the interest-free period is over, the interest rate will be something stupidly high. Now this goes against all good investment advice, which follows the principle of do not invest more than you can afford to lose. In this case, you don't even have the money, so you can't even afford to lose it all. So if you think about doing a rent-to-rent deal, please do not go out and fit the whole unit out on credit cards. If anything goes wrong with the deal or the landlord, you could be stuck with all that debt hanging over you, and it'll probably be somewhere between £5,000 to £15,000 depending on the setup of your unit. This is linked with the fact, in my opinion, which if you disagree with, please let me know in the comments, I do not actually think it's cheap to set up a rent-to-rent deal. The first Airbnb unit I set up cost around £8,000. Now this was targeted at the contractor market in St Helens, which is a commuter town in the northwest of England. And this was getting everything for as cheap as possible from places like IKEA and The Range. So the property was a nice standard for the target market, but if we were in a nicer area targeting travel guests who might have a higher expectation of quality in their accommodation, this could have easily climbed to close to £15,000 in no time at all. Now maybe I'm a bit mental, but that's not a small amount of money to me. In fact, you could put a 25% deposit down on a £60,000 house, which is certainly possible in the north of England. So the idea that you can set up these units with hardly any money, in my opinion, is a fantasy, to be honest. You need a decent amount of cash behind you to start a rent-to-rent business. Now in my situation, I was lucky I had two business partners who could split all the costs with me. But setting up the unit reaches a point where there's a trade-off between cost and customer experience. Now when we set up our second unit, we went for a traditional rent-to-rent deal through an estate agent. We spent around £3,000 and this involved bootstrapping absolutely everything. Tables from Facebook, reusing and recycling anything we could to set up the unit. But this unit needed a lot more spending on it to give the customer a good experience. And again, we were targeting the contractor market, but the difference between the first and the second unit in terms of quality was night and day in my opinion. Now the reason why we wanted to do the second unit like this was because we wanted to grow, but we had little money, as the other units had only been operating for 2 months and had turned a small profit by month 2. So we did not have a lot of capital, but we still didn't want to wait to grow. So we bought into this narrative that it's cheap to set up a rent-to-rent unit. The main issue with this leads on to probably the main reason why I'd never do a rent-to-rent deal again, And this is going to sound so obvious, and it's the whole reason behind rent to rent, but you never actually own the asset, you never own the property. When setting up our second unit, this had a massive impact on us, as to be honest, the property was not in the best condition, and we probably shouldn't have gone for it in hindsight. To give the landlord some credit, they did put in some new carpets before we took over the place, but I think they got the worst painter and decorator in, as the job they did was horrendous, which is something we actually ended up fixing with our own team when we got the keys. But the whole place was tired. The kitchen and bathroom needed a refurb as they were both dated. The issue with this from a rent-to-rent point of view is you do not want to spend a load of money improving someone else's asset. An example of this was the fact the boiler kept cutting out due to a fault. In the end, we had to pay for a gas engineer to go out and fix these issues. This is something people who pitch rent-to-rents will say,
get the landlord or estate agent to sort out any major issues.
If you do this, it will single-handedly ruin your Airbnb business. The boiler cut out on us while we had guests in one evening, and we tried to get in touch with the estate agents, and it went to an automatic voice message, and they said they would get back to us first thing in the morning. Now, this sort of service might wash for a normal tenant, but you're running an Airbnb business, which is fundamentally a service business, and we needed to get this issue sorted as soon as possible. So we ended up paying for the guests to get a Nando's while the guest engineer sorted the issues out. But this underlines the whole point. You do not want to spend a load of money improving someone else's asset when the rent-to-rent agreement might only be for 12 months, and imagine you'd paid for a new boiler or something. This would have been a really poor business decision. And second, they don't have a vested interest in providing a high quality of service which is needed for an Airbnb business. Another pillar of the rent-to-rent strategy is the cash flow you can make each month. If you have spent any time researching property investing, you know the monthly cash flow is not massive. You are typically doing well if you can make a net profit of a couple £100 a month from a buy-to-let property. Whereas if you do a rent-to-rent Airbnb, after 1 month you'll be going to the Lambo garage and putting a deposit down on an Aventador. I am of course joking, but rent-to-rent you can get some decent money through the door, especially when you compare it with a normal buy-to-let property. But you have to bear in mind you've got so much more to pay for. Between paying for a channel manager, cleaning and managing consumables for the unit, you can rack up a decent amount of overheads. The amount of money you end up making can be even less if you get everything on a credit card and have to pay this back every month. So it's vital to remember this when you're seeing how much people are saying they're making from rent-to-rent deal. The revenue numbers might be massive, but it's always the net cash flow you want to know. I think this comes to a point around Airbnb as a property investment strategy. It's not true. It is 100% a hospitality business because all of your focus needs to be on the guest, and this means it is not passive at all, as you can never switch your phone off when you're running an Airbnb business. In fact, this is something at the start of 2020 I experienced. I was away on holiday skiing and I got a call from booking.com saying a guest had accidentally cancelled one of their reservations, and it was at this point I thought I definitely need a more passive investment strategy and realised that there's a difference between a business and an investment strategy. In summary, the reasons why I'd never do a rent-to-rent deal again are it costs a lot to set them up, you never own the assets over the long term so you don't get the benefit of capital growth, and the cash flow is not always everything it's made out to be. Although in my opinion running an Airbnb business is a hospitality business, I would 100% own an Airbnb unit, but I would pay for someone else to manage it. Now I'm not saying you cannot make a rent-to-rent Airbnb deals work, as I know loads of people who make it work, but given my experience, I do not think it's worth the time, as I personally want assets which can grow over the long term without me having to do anything to them. If you found this video useful, please consider hitting the subscribe button for me. And if you're looking at getting involved in Airbnb, please check out my beginners and ultimate guides. And I will hopefully see you in the next video, guys. Cheers.